The sound comes before the light. A diesel engine, low and deliberate, the kind that gets into your chest before it reaches your ears. 3 seconds. Then it stops. The silence that follows is not peaceful. It is the silence of something that used to run and no longer does. Then the light comes up on a different kind of stillness. A kitchen in Dumfries, Virginia, 5:45 in the morning. The window above the sink holds the last of the dark, that particular blue that has not yet decided to become gray. On the table, a coffee cup gone cold, a folded newspaper, and 2 hands lying flat against the wood as if the man they belong to is feeling for a pulse in the table itself. Harold Eugene Marsh is 78 years old. He does not look like a man who just woke up. He looks like a man who has been awake for some time and has spent that time sitting very still, with a decision he made several minutes ago and has not yet moved to act on. The apartment is small and organized by a logic that belongs entirely to him. Not the logic of comfort or decoration, but the logic of a man who does not put anything anywhere without a reason. The bookshelf in the living room holds technical publications arranged by year. No photographs on the walls, no trophies, no plaques, nothing that says, "Look what I did." The absence of those things is not humility. It is a different kind of order. He organizes his life around what he knows, not around what he has done. There is one exception. On the shelf inside the bedroom doorway, visible from where Harold sits, there is a pair of reading glasses. A woman's glasses, the frame small and slightly oval. Margaret Ann Marsh wore those glasses for the last 6 years of her life. She died in 2018. For a year after Harold kept the glasses on this table within arm's reach. Then he moved them to the bedroom shelf. Not because he was ready, because he had knocked them to the floor twice in a single week, and understood he was not living in the apartment correctly yet. Some mornings he looks toward the bedroom doorway. This morning he does not. He looks at the newspaper. He has read the same sentence 3 times. The words are not difficult. The meaning is not unclear. He is reading it a 3rd time because the first 2 times he read it as information, and this time he is reading it as instruction. The M60A1 restoration project is nearing a final determination. Final determination. He knows what that phrase means in the language of institutions. He has spent enough years inside large organizations to know that final determination is what they say when they mean we are done trying. It is a phrase designed to sound like conclusion, when what it actually is surrender. He sets the newspaper down. His hands remain flat on the table. 4 minutes pass. He is not thinking. He decided before he finished reading the sentence. The 4 minutes are for his body to catch up to what his mind already knows it is going to do. Then he stands. He goes to the chair by the door. The canvas bag sits there, the way it has sat in one form or another since 1969. Olive drab once, now faded to a color that is somewhere between gray and memory. He checks the rubber bands on the notebook without removing it from the bag. 2 bands replaced last year. He lifts the flap and looks at what is inside. The notebook, the photograph, and the small sealed package wrapped in oilcloth that he has carried to this museum every Wednesday for 4 years without once needing to open it. He closes the flap, lifts the bag onto his shoulder. He goes to find his field jacket. Today is Tuesday. He did not wait for Wednesday. The drive takes 40 minutes. He does not turn on the radio. The roads at this hour belong to people who work with their hands. Delivery drivers, construction crews. Men and women beginning shifts that started before the rest of the world opened its eyes. Harold fits among them without effort. He drives the way he does most things, with his full attention and without unnecessary motion. He made a promise to Margaret about this tank. He told her he would go inside the museum when they were about to give up on it. She had looked at him for a long moment when he said that. And then she said, "That is a very strange kind of plan." He had thought about that sentence every Wednesday for 4 years, standing in the parking lot, listening, waiting for the sounds of work to stop. 3 months ago, the sounds stopped. He is 4 years late, which by his own accounting is exactly on time. 40 miles south and 2 hours earlier, the man who had spent 15 years building his reputation on never being wrong about a vehicle was presenting the evidence of the one time he could not find the answer. Dr. Kevin Strand stood at the head of the restoration bay in the National Museum of the Marine Corps and walked Colonel Diane Foster and Staff Sergeant Derek Owens through 12 channels of diagnostic data for the 4th morning in a row. The equipment behind him represented $40,000 of the finest automotive diagnostic technology available for heavy armored vehicles. 12 cables ran from a laptop interface to attachment points across the M60A1, monitoring compression fuel pressure, electrical output, hydraulic fluid levels, and half a dozen other variables in real time. Everything read normal. The Continental AVDS1790 engine showed compression within specification across all 12 cylinders. Fuel delivery pressure, nominal. Electrical system functional. Starter motor operational. Transmission fluid levels appropriate, no metal contamination in the pan. Every system green. Every reading inside manufacturer tolerance. The tank should run. It did not run. Strand had restored 12 armored vehicles in 8 years. This methodology had never failed to locate a mechanical fault when one existed. He had built a career on it. He had taught it to others. And he had spent 4 days watching it return results that were technically perfect and practically useless. His recommendation was on the screen in front of Foster. Source replacement vehicle. Decommission this unit for parts. Owens stood near the rear of the tank and said nothing. He had been over the data himself. He did not disagree with Strand's findings. He had spent 8 months on this vehicle. He had checked everything he knew to check. His silence was not resentment. It was the honest quiet of a competent man who has reached the edge of what he knows and found nothing on the other side. Private First Class. Amy Connors stood near the tool bench along the left wall and also said nothing. She was 24 years old, and this was the first major restoration project she had worked on from start to finish. She had her own logbook, her own notes going back 3 months and one entry from 3 weeks ago that she had raised with Strand and that Strand had closed without following up. She raised it again now. She did not raise it gently. She said, 3 weeks ago, I logged that the auxiliary intake housing was showing an abnormal surface condition. The interior metal was too clean, not consistent with the vehicle's storage timeline. I flagged it. You noted it had no diagnostic value and closed the entry. Strand looked at her with the specific patience of a man who has heard a junior technician challenge a conclusion before and knows exactly how this conversation goes. He said the note she had written described an aesthetic observation. Cleanness of a metal surface was not a functional diagnostic indicator. His equipment had scanned every accessible system in the vehicle. Nothing registered outside parameters. Connors stood her ground without raising her voice. She said she understood that. But she had been inside every accessible section of this vehicle for 3 months. And there was a difference between clean from maintenance and clean from absence. She could not tell him what was absent. She only knew something was. Strand said that was not a measurement. She said no. But it might be a direction. The bay went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of consensus, but the tight quiet of two people who are both partially right and know it and cannot yet prove the part the other person needs to see. Owens looked at the floor. Colonel Diane Foster stood at the mouth of the bay entrance and watched all of it without speaking. She had 31 years of experience watching people in rooms, and she knew the difference between a disagreement and a discovery in progress. She did not know yet which one this was. She did not intervene. She read people the way other officers read maps, looking for the terrain beneath the surface. She was still reading when she heard footsteps in the corridor behind her. Senator Robert Harwell walked with the unhurried authority of a man who has spent enough years in rooms where other people were grateful for his presence. He was 64, silver-haired, dressed in a suit that cost more than most mechanics made in a month. Behind him came a younger man in architectural clothing and a woman in corporate attire who had not introduced herself to anyone and did not appear to feel the need. He stopped beside Foster and looked through the bay entrance at the M60A1. He was there, he said, to check in on preparations for the 50th anniversary celebration. Just a brief visit. He wanted to make sure the museum's major projects were moving forward on schedule. Foster said they were finalizing the assessment on the restoration vehicle. Harwell said he was glad to hear that. He said the museum's board was very interested in the long-term sustainability of its exhibition spaces. He said there had been some exciting conversations with private sector partners about modernizing certain areas of the facility, and that those conversations had generated a great deal of enthusiasm among the kind of donors who kept institutions like this one healthy. He said all of this while looking at the tank. Foster heard every word underneath the words he was actually saying. She had been in this job long enough to understand that a senator does not visit a museum restoration bay at 8 in the morning to discuss anniversary celebrations. He was there because something in that bay was standing between him and something he wanted. She did not yet know what he had already set in motion. She would find out. She told him she would have a full update for the board by the end of the week. He nodded with the satisfaction of a man who has just been told what he wanted to hear, whether it was what she actually meant or not. He and his two companions moved down the corridor toward the main exhibition hall. Foster turned back to the bay. Strand was closing his laptop. Owens had moved to the far side of the tank. Connors had not moved at all. Across the museum parking lot, a gray Chevrolet Malibu had been sitting in the third row with its engine off for 11 minutes. Gerald Marsh was 52 years old and had done this kind of work for 15 years. Site assessments, feasibility analysis, independent evaluations for contractors, government agencies and oversight committees. He was good at it. He had a reputation for being thorough and unemotional and delivering findings that were accurate even when they were inconvenient. His company had a contract with the senator's office that went back 7 years. This engagement was routine. He had not known which museum until he looked at the briefing documents on the drive up. He sat with the engine off and the folder open on the passenger seat. National Museum of the Marine Corps, M60A1 Restoration Assessment, Independent Evaluation of Long-Term Restoration, Viability, and Cost-Benefit Analysis. He had looked at the name of the museum for a moment. Then he had looked out the windshield at the building. He knew his father had served in the 1st Tank Battalion. He knew his father cared about this museum. These facts were not relevant to a contract assessment. He was a professional. Relevance was something he measured in data, not in family history. He opened the folder again, read the project summary, closed it, opened it a third time. He sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes and did not call anyone and could not have explained precisely what he was waiting for. There was something ahead of him in that building that he was not sure he wanted to look at directly, and he had enough self-awareness to know it, but not enough distance to name it. He had been in this posture before, not in parking lots, in other situations where the work in front of him and something older and unresolved in him occupied the same space. He had always resolved it by doing the work. The doing was how he kept the rest of it at arm's length. He picked up the folder, got out of the car. Harold Marsh arrived at the main entrance at 8:47 in the morning and was politely stopped by a receptionist who told him the restoration bay was a restricted access area. Visitors required an appointment or a press credential. She was not unkind about it. She simply stated the policy the way people in institutional roles state policies, as if the policy itself were the entire answer. Harold thanked her. He asked for the name of the officer in charge of the restoration project. The receptionist said she was not able to provide personnel information. He thanked her again. Then he sat down in a chair in the main lobby and waited. He did not look at his phone. He did not have a magazine. He sat with the canvas bag on his lap and his hands resting on it, and he waited with the particular stillness of a man who has waited before and understands that patience is not passive. Patience is a form of pressure applied slowly, without announcement. He had been sitting there for 12 minutes when Amy Connors came through the lobby on her way to get coffee from the staff lounge. She saw him and slowed without deciding to. It was not that he looked threatening or confused or lost. It was almost the opposite. He looked like someone who had come to exactly the right place and was prepared to sit there until the place agreed with him. The bag on his lap was old enough to have history. The field jacket was not a costume. The stillness was not the stillness of someone waiting for directions. It was the stillness of someone who already knew where he was going and was simply waiting for the door to open. She stopped. She asked who he was waiting for. He said the person responsible for the M60A1. She looked at him. She had spent 3 months on that vehicle. She had fought this morning for a note that nobody wanted to follow up on, and she had lost, and she was now walking to get coffee because she needed 30 seconds away from the smell of diesel and the sound of Strand's conclusive silence. She said, "Why?" He said he knew why it was not running. She stood in the middle of the lobby with her coffee thermos in her hand and looked at this old man for a long moment. She made a calculation that was less about logic and more about the specific quality of certainty she heard in those 8 words. Not the certainty of someone who is guessing confidently. The certainty of someone who is stating a fact that has been a fact for a long time and is only now being said out loud. She said, "Follow me." The restoration bay smelled of Strand's diagnostic equipment when Harold stepped inside. Something faintly electrical, clean and artificial. The smell of precision instruments doing their precise work. It should have smelled of fuel and metal, and the particular richness of a large diesel engine running. That it did not was itself a kind of information. Harold did not look at the diagnostic table. He did not look at Strand or Owens or the screens displaying their 4 days of perfect useless data. He looked at the M60A1. 60 tons of olive drab steel sitting on the bay floor in the particular silence of machinery that has gone too long without purpose. There was something about it that was not the silence of a dead thing. Something in the proportions, in the specific geometry of it that held the memory of motion, the way an empty chair holds the shape of the person who last sat in it. Harold walked to it. He put his right hand on the hull above the driver's hatch and held it there. Not pressing, not examining. The way you would lay your hand on the shoulder of someone you have not seen in a long time. Strand watched him for a moment. Then he said, "And the restoration bay is a restricted area, and the public entrance is through the main lobby, and he would be happy to have someone walk him there." Harold did not move. He said, "You have been looking in the wrong place." Strand closed his laptop with the measured action of a man who is about to have a conversation. he did not expect to have. He said he had run a complete diagnostic on every system in the vehicle. 15 years of experience, 12 vehicles restored, $40,000 of equipment. If a fault existed, his methodology would have found it. He paused. Then he asked how long Harold had been working with these vehicles. Harold moved his left hand to the serial number plate without looking at it. His fingers knew where it was. They had always known. He read the number aloud. Lima, Ohio. Third production run A1 variant. Shipped from the manufacturer in September of 1969. 1st Tank Battalion. NATO deployment. Grafenwohr Training Area, Bavaria, West Germany. She ran from the fall of 1969 through the spring of 1970, 12 weeks of continuous field operations in conditions that the design engineers in Lima had never planned for, and she did not lose a single day of operational status. He turned to face Strand. She is not dead. She is missing something. Strand gestured at the diagnostic array. He said his equipment had tested every system. Harold looked at him with the patience of a man who has simplified a complex thing so many times he can do it without effort. Your equipment tested what is there. It cannot test what is gone. The bay went quiet. Not the quiet of agreement. The quiet of a sentence that has just reordered the room. Strand stood with the particular stillness of someone whose methodology has just encountered a category it was not designed to handle. He did not argue. He was too precise a thinker to argue against logic he could not immediately disprove. He turned back to his laptop and opened it and typed something, not dismissing Harold, but checking the way a careful man checks even the things that inconvenience him. Connors stepped forward from her position near the tool bench. She had brought Harold in. That made what happened next in some way she could not fully articulate partly hers. She said, 3 weeks ago, I noted the auxiliary intake housing was showing an unusual surface condition. Too clean. Not consistent with the vehicle's storage and service history. Harold looked at her. She said, you are talking about something in that area, aren't you? He held her gaze for a moment. In it was neither confirmation nor denial. Something closer to recognition. You saw something real that look said. You did not know what it meant, but you saw the right thing. He said, I need your mechanic. Foster, who had moved to a position near the bay entrance without anyone noticing, raised her hand slightly when Owens took a half step forward. She said, let him look. Owens said, Colonel, he is a civilian. Foster said, so is Dr. Strand. Let him look. Harold began to move around the tank. His right hand trailed the hull as he walked. It was not the way the diagnostic crew had moved around it. They had moved around it like an object to be measured. Harold moved around it like a space he used to inhabit, like a room he had lived in for so long that his body still remembered its dimensions even after all these years, even with the hip that had stiffened and the left knee that negotiated with every set of stairs. His body had not forgotten the geometry. He completed most of the circuit and stopped at the rear of the vehicle. He crouched. He ran his thumb along the interior lip of the auxiliary intake housing. He stood. He said who performed the 2001 restoration. Owens checked his tablet. Private contractor. Company no longer in operation. Harold said, did they document what they removed? Owens scrolled through the parts manifest. Standard components, he said. Harold nodded once the nod of a man who expected that answer. He said there was a valve that would not appear on any standard parts manifest. Small, approximately thumb-sized. Green from oxidation by now. He had been in this vehicle since 1970. Owens looked up from his tablet. He looked at Strand. He looked back at Harold. He said there was no valve matching that description anywhere in the record. Harold said, "I know." Strand, who had been listening with the controlled attention of a specialist, hearing something that did not fit his model, said that if a non-standard component existed in the vehicle, it would have shown up in the diagnostic scan. The fuel system sweep had been comprehensive. "It is not in the fuel system," Harold said. "It is adjacent to it. If you do not know it exists, you do not know where to look for it. And if it was removed during a restoration and not reinstalled and not logged, there will be no trace of it in any system your equipment can read. Because your equipment reads systems. And this was never part of any system in any manual ever written." Strand went quiet. He did not go quiet the way people go quiet when they are dismissed. He went quiet the way careful men go quiet when they are thinking. He turned back to his laptop. He was no longer typing to disprove. He was typing to understand. Harold put his hand back on the hull. A single point of contact. A man orienting himself inside a familiar space before entering it. He began to climb. The movement was deliberate in the way that things done 10,000 times become deliberate, stripped of all hesitation, but also of all ease. The body still knowing the sequence, even when it can no longer perform it without cost. His right hand found the first handhold without looking. His left knee took the first step. With the careful negotiation of a joint that remembers it used to do this differently, he reached the commander's hatch. His hands found the release without searching for it. He opened it. He looked down into the interior. Owens had his phone in his hand without knowing how it got there. He opened the stopwatch application. His thumb rested on the start button. He pressed it. From inside the tank, metallic sounds, tapping, regular and specific, the resonance of a man in a small metal space who knows where everything is moving through it, by memory, rather than by sight. The rhythm of it was not random. It was the rhythm of a search conducted not by someone who is looking, but by someone who is going directly to what they already know is there, simply verifying its presence or its absence. Strand had moved from his diagnostic table. He was standing 3 feet from the side of the tank without having decided to move there. Something in the sound had drawn him. He stood with his arms at his sides and listened. Foster watched from the entrance, her hands clasped behind her back. Connors was closest to the vehicle. She had one hand resting on the hull very lightly, almost without pressure. The tapping slowed, changed register, became the sound of a specific search in a specific small space. Then it stopped. 1 second of silence. Then, muffled through 60 tons of steel and decades of waiting, a single quiet sentence from inside. "There you are." It was at precisely this moment that Gerald Marsh stepped through the side entrance of the restoration bay with a leather portfolio under his arm, and the careful expression of a man conducting a professional evaluation. He stopped when he saw the tank. He stopped again differently when he saw the open commander's hatch. He knew that hatch, not from documentation, not from research, from a photograph on the kitchen counter of his childhood home. A photograph his mother had kept in a frame that moved from room to room over the years, as if it could not find the right wall. In that photograph, a young man in field utilities stood beside an M60A1 with his hand on the hull. The serial number on the vehicle was visible. The man was 23 years old and bore a resemblance to the man Gerald saw in the mirror every morning of his adult life. He recognized the hatch from that photograph before he recognized the vehicle from the briefing documents. He stood in the entrance to the bay with his portfolio under his arm and said nothing. Owens looked up from his phone and said, "Can I help you?" Gerald said his name. Gerald Marsh, Redstone Assessment Group. He had an appointment with Colonel Foster. Owens looked at him, then looked at the hatch, then looked back at Gerald. Foster turned from the tank entrance. She looked at Gerald Marsh the way she had looked at everyone else that morning, as someone to be read and understood. She took in the name, the portfolio, the careful, professional expression, and the way his eyes kept returning without permission to the open hatch in the top of the vehicle. She had been in this work long enough to know what it looked like when someone was trying very hard not to be affected by something. She said she would be with him in just a moment. From inside the tank, the tapping had resumed slower now. A man in a very small space making his final measurements. A man who has known the answer for 55 years and is now, for the first time, in a position to give it. The tapping stopped. Not gradually. Not the way a search winds down when it is narrowing towards something. It stopped clean and complete the way a man stops moving when he has put his hand on exactly what he came for. Everyone in the bay heard it. The absence of sound where sound had been is its own kind of announcement. Owens stared at his phone. Strand stood 3 feet from the tank with his arms at his sides. Foster had not moved from the bay entrance. Connors had her hand still resting on the hull from the moment she had placed it there, without deciding to. Gerald Marsh stood with his portfolio against his chest and his eyes on the open hatch, and the particular quality of stillness that comes over a person who is watching something they cannot fully prepare themselves to see. Then the voice came up through the steel. There you are. 4 words. Quiet enough that not everyone caught them, present enough that the people nearest to the tank felt them arrive before they processed the meaning. The voice of a man who has been looking for something for a very long time and has not forgotten even now how to be still when he finds it. Harold Marsh appeared at the hatch. He came up carefully, not because he was struggling, but because he was carrying something in his right hand, and he was not going to drop it. He had been inside that vehicle for 3 minutes and 11 seconds. Owens read both numbers from his phone. 23 years, 3 months, 11 days since the last operational attempt on this machine. 3 minutes and 11 seconds from the moment Harold disappeared into the hatch to the moment he reappeared with the answer in his hand. Owens said both numbers in the same flat voice, one after the other, and said nothing else because those numbers were the entire statement, and he understood that adding to them would only diminish them. Harold climbed down. His left knee negotiated each step with the careful deliberation of a joint that had made this particular descent many times before, and now required a conversation with gravity that it had once conducted without thought. He reached the bay floor and turned and held out what he was carrying. Owens took it with both hands. It was small, thumb-sized. Its original surface was lost under decades of oxidation that had turned it the greenish gray of old copper left in weather. It was lighter than it looked. It did not appear to be the reason a 60-ton machine had been silent for 23 years. Connors crossed the bay in 4 steps. She took the oxidized piece from Owens's hands and picked up a standard M6 OA, 1 intake component from the bench, and held one in each palm. She did not look at them. She closed her eyes and felt the difference. Weight, surface, geometry, the specific profile of the mounting flanges. The standard component had been machined to a specification written in a factory. The thing in her other hand had not. She opened her eyes. She said, "What is this?" Harold set the canvas bag on the work table and opened it and removed the notebook and turned to page 47 and placed it flat without ceremony or announcement. The schematic was hand-drawn in pencil and ink. Dimensions in the margin, installation angles, torque specifications, failure modes and their indicators. The precise, unhurried work of a 23-year-old who understood even in the moment of making it that this needed to outlast the conditions that had made it necessary. He told them what it was: an auxiliary intake bypass valve, designed to prevent moisture and particulate matter from entering the combustion chamber during extended field operations in sustained wet ground conditions. The factory intake system on the M60A1 was engineered for standard operational parameters. It was not engineered for 12 continuous weeks of NATO winter exercises in the forests of Bavaria. Standing water and dense mud and temperatures that stayed just above freezing long enough to find every gap that the engineers in Lima, Ohio had not thought to seal. In the autumn of 1969, 3 vehicles in Harold's unit hydro-locked in the combustion chamber within a single week. The technical manual did not contain a solution. The manual had been written for a different set of problems. Harold had worked out the fix with Corporal Ray Donaldson and Sergeant Frank Westbrook. The 3 of them had fabricated the first version from field-available components and installed it in this vehicle in October of 1969 at Grafenvohr. It had remained in this vehicle from that point forward. When the 2001 restoration team disassembled the vehicle, they had removed it. They had not known what it was. It carried no part number, appeared in no catalog, had no documentation trail that a contractor working from standard records could follow. So they had set it aside or discarded it, and when they reassembled the vehicle, the space it had occupied was clean and empty, and completely invisible to any diagnostic system that did not know to ask for it. Strand had moved to the work table. He was looking at page 47 with the specific attention of a man who is not evaluating what he sees, but confronting it. He looked at the oxidized original in Connors's hand. He looked back at the schematic. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his own notebook and opened it and did not write anything. He looked at the page. He said carefully that his diagnostic scan had covered every accessible system in the vehicle, that the data was accurate, that the methodology was sound. He stopped. He said the rest of it as though discovering it in the act of speaking. The methodology was sound for the vehicle that existed in the present, not for the version of this machine that had been modified in the field by men operating outside any manual ever written. His equipment had read every system correctly. Every reading was accurate, and none of it had been looking in the right direction, because the right direction had not existed in any document he had ever been trained on. Harold looked at him without impatience. He said, "Your equipment tested what was there." He said it once. He did not repeat the rest. He had already said the rest, and Strand was precise enough to complete the logic without being guided through it. Strand turned back to the work table. He was writing now, not disputing, not defending, documenting. The notebook in his jacket pocket was for field measurements, and he was using it as one recording what he was seeing with the methodical attention of a professional who responds to being wrong, not by arguing but by updating. Gerald had set his portfolio on a chair near the bay entrance and crossed the floor without it. He stood 6 feet from the work table and watched his father explain the installation sequence to Owens, using the schematic as reference. The explanation was not instructional in the way that teachers instruct. It was transactional. Here is the sequence. Here is the reason for the sequence. Here is what happens if the sequence is not followed. The voice of a man who has delivered this information before in worse conditions to people who were learning it under pressure. Gerald had not heard that voice directed at him very often. He had heard it on the phone occasionally in the years before the phone call stopped. He had seen the posture in the photograph his mother kept on the kitchen counter for 30 years. He recognized both from a distance the way you recognize the light in a room you lived in as a child, before you understood what light was, or why certain rooms held it differently. He looked at the portfolio on the chair. He looked at the serial number plate on the hull. He did not go back to the portfolio. Harold reached into the canvas bag a second time and brought out a small oilcloth package secured with 2 rubber bands. He unwrapped it on the work table beside the open notebook. Inside was a valve identical in form and dimension to the oxidized original but clean machine to the specifications on page 47, from the same materials fabricated 2 decades ago, when Harold had seen the restoration project announced and understood what the machine would eventually need. He had carried it to this parking lot every Wednesday for 4 years. He had not once needed to bring it inside. He had brought it anyway because that was the kind of preparation that did not have an expiration date. He pushed it across the table toward Owens. He said, "You install it. This is your vehicle now." Owens looked at the replacement, looked at the schematic, looked at Harold with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something that did not have a clean category. He said, "Talk me through it." 9 minutes. Harold stood beside Owens and gave instructions with the economy of a man who has performed this operation 40 times in conditions that were inferior to these in every measurable dimension. Cold, dark, timed not by choice but by circumstance, using tools designed for other purposes. His language was directional. Access point, angle, torque, sequence. He did not explain the reasons behind each step. He had already explained the reasons once. Owens followed each instruction exactly, his hands moving with the steadiness of someone who has been given clear information and trusts it. Connors held the light and tracked each step against the schematic, simultaneously running the two in parallel with the focused attention of a technician who was not only executing a task, but learning to understand one. She did not need to ask questions. The schematic and the instructions and the object in Owen's hands were all saying the same thing in different languages, and she was translating in real time. Strand did not leave. He moved to the side and made room and watched the entire 9 minutes without speaking. His diagnostic equipment stood behind him with its 12 cables and its 4 screens and its complete and accurate data, and he did not look at it. When the housing was closed and the valve was seated, Owens looked up from the work. He said, "That is it." Harold said, "That is it." Owens moved to the driver's compartment. Foster stepped fully into the bay and stood near the entrance wall. Strand moved back a single step, not retreating but creating space around what was about to happen. The instinct of a person making room for something that deserves room. Gerald had not moved from his position near the work table. He was very still. Harold was standing on the left side of the tank. His right hand was on the hull. He had not placed it there consciously. It had returned the way hands return to surfaces they have known for a long time, without instruction, without announcement. The hull was cold. The vehicle was silent. 60 tons of steel that had not run in 23 years. The engine turned over. Once. Twice. It caught. The Continental AVDS 1790V12 diesel found its idle in stages rough in the first seconds, and then smoothing as temperature reached the fuel, the sound rising from a tentative mechanical murmur into the full register of a machine built to be loud, running for the first time in 23 years in a room not designed to contain it. 750 horsepower, settling into steady rhythm. The vibration moved through 60 tons of steel into the concrete floor and through the souls of every person standing in that bay, present in their feet before it was present in their ears. No one spoke. The vibration moved through the hull and through Harold's palm and through the bones of his wrist and arm. He had felt this vibration in 1969 and 1970. He had felt it during operations in conditions that produced no documentation and left no official record and cost things that did not appear in any ledger. 55 years had changed the hearing and the back and the hair and the person who should have been standing in this room beside him. The vibration had not changed. He closed his eyes, not in relief, not in sentiment. The way you close your eyes when something you have waited for is finally exactly what you always knew it would be. And the darkness is not absence, but confirmation. 3 seconds. He opened them. He said, "There she is." Owens climbed out of the driver's seat and stood on the bay floor and held his phone and did not look at the stopwatch still running on the screen. He looked at the tank. He looked at Harold. He looked at the diagnostic equipment behind Strand with its complete and accurate and entirely insufficient data. He did not say anything. Some accountings are better made in silence than in words. The engine ran. Gerald was looking at his father's hand on the hull, not at the machine, not at the equipment, at the hand. He had seen that hand in a photograph his entire life and understood for the first time what it looked like in context, in the place it had been formed against the surface. It had learned itself against. 55 years ago. Foster was already on the phone moving toward the corridor to call the curator and the history division. In 40 minutes, the bay was going to fill with administrators and documentation specialists and people who would want to know what had happened here, in sequentially larger institutional terms. The quiet that existed in this moment was finite, and she understood that, and noted it the way a navigator notes a landmark before it passes from view. Strand had returned to the work table. He was not looking at his diagnostic screens. He was at the notebook, not at page 47, but earlier, working backward through the entries. Technical notes, diagrams, dates, names abbreviated in the margins, the shorthand of a working document never intended for outside readers. He was reading with the specific attention of someone who is not looking for technical information, but for something else, something he has not yet defined clearly enough to name. He turned to a page near the front. He stopped. He opened his laptop. He navigated from memory to a technical paper he had read first as a graduate student and had returned to many times in the 15 years since, because it was foundational, and because the man who wrote it had been foundational to his understanding of this exact field. A 1972 paper by Professor Dale Whitaker of the Naval Postgraduate School, Armored Vehicle Field Maintenance Doctrine. The paper that had become the methodological basis for the manual that had formed the basis for the training that had formed the basis for the approach that Strand had spent 15 years refining and teaching and applying. He looked at a specific detail in the mechanical drawings of the 1972 paper, the way the cross-hatching was executed on section cuts. A small stylistic habit, the kind that accumulates in a person's technical drafting over years of practice, until it becomes invisible to the person doing it and identifiable to anyone who knows what to look for. He looked at the same detail in Harold's notebook. Not similar. Identical. He looked at the biographical timeline he had loaded in a second window. He had read Whitaker's biography many times. The 1970 entry NATO assessment team, Grafenwöhr Training Area, Bavaria, West Germany. March through May. Harold had installed the valve in October 1969. He had submitted the notebook to his commanding officer in February 1970. Whitaker had arrived at Grafenwöhr in March 1970. The paper that had become foundational doctrine was published in 1972, with Whitaker's name on it. Strand sat with the two documents open on the screen and the notebook open on the table beside the laptop, and said nothing for a long moment. Gerald appeared at his shoulder. He had moved from his position near the work table while Strand was reading and was now standing close enough to see both screens. He looked at the cross-hatching in the 1972 paper. He looked at the notebook. He said he had read the Whitaker paper. He recognized the drafting style from the notebook. Strand looked at him. Gerald said he had been in the doorway since before the engine started. A pause opened between them that was not uncomfortable but was precise. Two men triangulating the same set of facts from different angles and arriving at a conclusion that neither of them was going to say first. Strand said slowly that the independent evaluation Gerald had been contracted to produce had used his own report as its primary technical foundation. Gerald said he understood that. Strand said that his report had been built on a methodology derived from doctrine whose origins had now become less clear than they had appeared this morning. Gerald said he was aware. A moment. Gerald said he was going to request an extension for additional data collection. He said the additional data was currently sitting on an ammunition crate 20 feet away in a field jacket from a different decade. Strand said that the additional data would also have implications beyond the immediate assessment. Gerald said he understood that too. Strand asked what Gerald intended to do about those implications. Gerald looked at his father on the ammunition crate, who was looking at the running tank with the expression of a man whose full attention has already moved to the next thing, which was simply the fact of the machine running. Gerald said he wanted to understand it first before he decided what to do about it. He said he had spent his professional life making decisions based on complete information, and he was not going to stop doing that because the complete information was inconvenient. It was at this moment that Senator Robert Harwell walked back into the restoration bay. He had heard the engine from the corridor. The sound had reached him while he was in the main exhibition hall reviewing conceptual drawings of the Novatech interactive installation, which occupied in those drawings precisely the square footage currently occupied by the restoration bay and its 60-ton obstacle. He had walked back through the administrative corridor with the purposeful economy of a man whose schedule had just been interrupted by a development he had specifically arranged not to happen. He came through the entrance and took in the running tank and the people arranged around it, and the notebook on the work table, and Harold on the ammunition crate. And he performed the calculation that men in his position perform, automatically assessing the room for leverage and finding less of it than he had expected to find. He crossed the bay and stood in front of Harold. He said he was glad to see such significant progress on the restoration. He said the board remained committed to responsible stewardship of facility resources. He said that operational status under controlled conditions was one metric among many in assessing long-term exhibition viability. He said all of this in the measured, reasonable tone of a man who has learned to make objectionable things sound like careful management. Harold looked up at him. He said, "You are talking about the space." Harwell said that resource management involved multiple considerations. Harold said you signed a contract for that square footage before the board approved the allocation. Foster has known about it for a month. The engine ran. The floor vibrated. Harwell looked at Foster across the bay. Foster looked back at him with the expression of someone who had just been accurately quoted and was neither confirming nor denying the quote because the accuracy of the quote was sufficient on its own. Harwell looked back at Harold. He began a sentence about long-term institutional planning. Harold said those men served in this vehicle. He said it without inflection, the way you state a map coordinate. Not a sentiment, a fact. He said you removed the machine without knowing what was done in it. You removed the record of what they built and what it cost them to build it. You do not get to unknow that once the machine is gone. The bay was very quiet underneath the sound of the engine. Harwell said that the museum's interpretive mission could be fulfilled through multiple formats, and that physical artifacts were one element of a comprehensive approach. Harwell's two companions appeared in the entrance without anyone having noticed them leave or return. Gerald Marsh stepped forward. He said his name and his firm, and he said that Harwell's office had engaged that firm for the independent evaluation of this asset. He said he was not going to file the evaluation on the contracted timeline. He said the assessment was incomplete because the vehicle had been restored under conditions that required additional documentation before a defensible conclusion could be reached. He said filing an incomplete evaluation would constitute a professional error that his firm did not make regardless of the contracting relationship. He said it with the same level tone he used for all difficult work. The tone that had served him for 15 years in rooms where convenience and accuracy occupied different sides of the table. He said it, and he did not look at his father. Harwell looked at him for a moment. He looked at Foster. He looked at the running tank and the notebook on the work table and the diagnostic equipment with its 12 cables and its 4 days of data that had not been enough. He said he looked forward to receiving the updated assessment at the earliest opportunity. He turned and walked out. His two companions followed. The kineticism of the exit was different from the entrance. He moved like a man who understood that the moment he chose to leave had cost him something, and was choosing it anyway because staying would cost more. No one spoke for a moment. The engine ran. Owens let out a breath. Connors set down the standard intake component she had been holding for 40 minutes and placed it on the bench with a small, careful sound. The sound of something set down because it is no longer needed. Gerald picked up his portfolio from the chair. He held it. He set it back down. He did not pick it up again. Harold was on the ammunition crate. He had watched the senator leave with the same expression he had applied to everything else today. The expression of a man who has rationed his attention carefully and has not allocated any of it to things that will resolve themselves without him. Strand had not moved from the work table during any of it. He was at the notebook again. He had turned past page 47. He was moving toward the front of the document, reading each page with the deliberate attention of someone who is no longer looking for technical answers. He reached the first page. He went still. There was a list, not a diagram, not a schematic. Names, 13 of them in the same vertical, careful handwriting as everything else in this document, arranged in a column with service dates noted in the margin beside each one. The first entry dated 1969. The last dated 1971. 13 names that Strand had never seen in no database he had ever accessed, occupying the very first page of a document that had just rewritten everything he thought he knew about the methodology that had defined his career. He looked at the list for a long time. He looked across the bay at Harold sitting on the ammunition crate with his hand resting on the hull of the running tank, eyes forward. The posture of a man whose work is done and who is sitting now in the specific quiet of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just set part of it down. Strand said it quietly, barely above the sound of the engine directed at Gerald, who was standing nearest to him. He said, "Who are these men?" Strand asked the question quietly, and it hung in the air above the running engine like smoke. "Who are these men?" Harold heard it from across the bay. He did not answer immediately. Commander Thomas Briggs from the History Division had arrived 7 minutes earlier and was standing near the work table with a legal pad, having been called in by Foster and briefed in 2 sentences in the corridor. He was prepared to document whatever needed documenting. He was 20 years younger than anyone else in the room who mattered to what was about to happen. And he had the careful attentiveness of someone who understands he is present at something. He will spend the rest of his career trying to explain accurately. Harold was holding the notebook. He had picked it up from the work table after Harwell left and had been holding it since, not reading it. Just holding it in both hands the way you hold something before you decide to open it. One more time in a room full of people who do not yet understand what they are about to receive. He looked at Briggs. He looked at Owens and Connors and Strand and Foster and Gerald standing at different distances around the bay with the engine running underneath all of them. 1 second passed in which something moved across Harold's face that was not quite doubt. and was not quite hesitation, but was something between the two. Something private, the expression of a man asking a question, internally, that he would not have been able to articulate if someone had asked him to. Whether these people in this room with their diagnostic equipment and their portfolio assessments and their institutional calendars actually wanted to know about 13 men who had been dead for decades. Whether that knowledge had a home here or whether it would arrive and find no place to land. Then Connor said, "You told us you were not the only one who built this." She said it simply, not as a prompt, not as encouragement. As a fact she had recorded and was now returning to its owner. Harold opened the notebook to the first page. He read each name as Briggs wrote it down. He read them in the order they appeared, which was not alphabetical and not by rank, which was by when they had come into the work, which was its own kind of sequence and its own kind of respect. Corporal Ray Donaldson, Sergeant Frank Westbrook, Private First Class Leon Hayes, Corporal Arthur Barnes, Lance Corporal Bobby Greer, Private First Class James Caldwell, Staff Sergeant Marcus Ford, Corporal Raymond Duke, Private First Class Anthony Ross, Sergeant William Hodge, Corporal Peter Nance, Lance Corporal Frank Morrow, Private First Class Samuel Todd. He stopped. He said, "Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold E. Marsh." Briggs looked up from the legal pad. He asked whether any of these men were still living. Harold was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of searching for an answer, the quiet of a man who has known the answer for a long time and carries it in a specific location and takes it out and looks at it with the same care every time. He said, "I am the last one. 36 years. He said it with the same precision he applied to everything a count, not a lament. The engine ran under it. Connors was standing close enough to hear every word, and she looked down at her hands when he said it, not from avoidance but from the particular response that comes over a person when something large lands in a small space and the body needs somewhere to put it. She was 24 years old. Every man on that list had died younger than she was now. She had spent 3 months working on the machine those men had helped to build, and she had not known their names until 60 seconds ago. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what had just been said. Briggs asked whether Harold had documentation of the men's service beyond the notebook. Harold set the notebook on the work table and reached into the canvas bag and brought out the photograph and placed it face up without explanation between himself and Briggs. 13 men. This tank. Grafenvor, October 1969. The serial number visible on the hull behind them. He turned it over. 13 names in the same vertical hand written on the back in the field sometime after the photograph was taken, preserved by nothing more than the quality of the paper and the discipline of the man who had put them there. Briggs reached for it. Foster got there first. She took it with both hands and looked at the faces. Young men in field utilities, the dust and the utility of it. The ease of people who have worked long enough in close quarters to stand near each other without performing anything. She turned it over, read the names, turned it back, looked at the serial number on the tank in the photograph. She looked at the serial number on the tank 3 feet from where she was standing. She held both versions of the same machine in her hands simultaneously, 55 years apart, and the distance between them collapsed into something she felt physically before she processed it as thought. She said these men. Harold said Donaldson could fix anything with wire and profanity. He said Westbrook ate his field rations cold because he claimed it built character. And nobody argued with him about it because he was probably right. He said Hayes could fall asleep in a moving vehicle during a training exercise and wake up with the exact bearing they needed for the next waypoint, as if sleep was just another form of navigation for him. He continued, not eulogies, not remembrance in the formal sense. The specific, unrepeatable details that make a person irreducible to their name. The things that only accumulate in someone who was there and paid attention. He gave each man one sentence or two, and each sentence was accurate in the way that only proximity produces accuracy. He said they were very good at their work, and they were 20 years old, and I was 23, and we figured out how to keep these machines running in conditions they were never designed for. He stopped. He said, that is the whole story. That is all of it. The engine ran. Owens sat down on the ammunition crate next to Harold. Not because he was assigned there or because protocol indicated he should be. Because it was the right place to be, and his body understood that before his rank did. They sat for a moment without talking. The room had been full of talking since Harold arrived, and now it had reached a place where the talking was finished. Not because everything had been said, but because the most important things had been. And what remained needed something other than words to settle into the right shape. Owen said, what were they like when things went wrong? Harold looked at the tank. He said Barnes never raised his voice when things went wrong. He said the more serious the situation, the quieter Barnes got. And when Barnes went completely silent in the middle of a problem, you knew you were about to see something that would solve it. He said Greer did the opposite, and it worked equally well for him because his noise was productive, it had direction, and it brought everyone in the immediate vicinity to the same level of urgency at the same time, which was its own kind of skill. He said these things looking at the tank and not at Owens, and Owens listened the same way, looking forward, two men sitting with the same orientation. The posture of people who have learned that certain conversations are easier when you are both looking at the same thing. Strand waited until Briggs had finished his notes and crossed the bay to make a phone call, and Foster had stepped out briefly to update the curator. He waited until the bay had reached a manageable quiet. Then he crossed the floor to Harold, without his laptop, without his legal pad, without any of the instruments that had defined his presence in this room for 4 days. He stood. He said that the diagnostic he had performed was the correct diagnostic for every vehicle he had worked on before this one. Harold said yes. He said it was not the correct diagnostic for this vehicle. Harold said no. Strand said the difference was a field modification installed in 1969 by a crew chief who was still alive. He said that was not a category his methodology accounted for. Harold said your methodology is correct for machines maintained by the book in conditions the book describes. This machine was modified in the field to survive conditions the book did not describe. Those are different objects that happen to share a serial number. Strand was quiet. Then he said he should have asked more questions before he wrote the recommendation. Harold looked at him. He said, you ran the right tests for what you knew to look for. You simply did not know what to look for. That is what I am here for. Strand absorbed this. He looked at the tank. Then he said there was something else. He described the 1972 paper. He described Whitaker's arrival at Grafenvohr in the spring of 1970. He described what he had found when he looked at the cross-hatching in the technical drawings. He said all of it plainly, the way you deliver information that reflects badly on something you care about clearly and without mitigation. Because accuracy is the only form of respect the situation deserves. Harold listened without surprise. He said he had known Whitaker came to Grafenvohr. He said he had submitted the notebook to his commanding officer in February of 1970 and had never received a response. He said the doctrine had appeared under a different name in 1972, and he had seen it and understood what had happened. Strand said, and you said nothing. Harold said I was angry for a period. Then I understood that the work being used was what mattered. His voice carried no residue of the old anger, and no performance of peace with it either. It was the voice of a man who has genuinely resolved something and does not need it acknowledged. He said the 13 men on that list did not need their names on a doctoral paper. They needed the machines they sat inside to function correctly in the conditions they were actually operating in. Strand said he intended to contact the Doctrine Review Office. He said he would use his name and his 15 years, and he would request a formal attribution review. He said he understood it might not change the historical record, but that the request would itself become part of the record. He said he would put all 14 names in the recommendation, not 13. Harold looked at him for a moment. He said, "Suit yourself." It was the closest thing to acceptance that his voice was capable of, and Strand received it as the significant thing it was. Gerald found his father after Strand had returned to the work table. The bay had filled and emptied twice in the past hour, administrators coming to confirm what Foster had reported, and then retreating to make calls of their own. The machine was still running. No one had turned it off. No one wanted to be the first to do it. Harold was alone on the ammunition crate for the first time since Owens had left to brief a junior technician. Gerald carried no portfolio. He had left it on the chair by the entrance, and it remained there uncollected, the only object in the bay that was not where it was supposed to be. He sat down on the crate beside his father. There was a gap between them, not unfriendly, calibrated the gap of two people who have spent a long time in each other's vicinity without occupying the same space. He said, "Did you know what this project was before you came in this morning?" Harold said no. Gerald said, "I knew who operated the 1st Tank Battalion at Grafenvor. I knew you cared about this museum. I knew both of those things, and I still did not connect them until I was sitting in the parking lot looking at the building." Harold waited. Gerald said he had sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes without being able to explain to himself what he was waiting for. Harold said, "I know what that is." Gerald said, "I was parked out there while you were standing at the front desk." A pause. Harold said, "I sat in this parking lot every Wednesday for 4 years and did not go in." He said it without self-examination or apology as a parallel data point, something offered rather than declared. Gerald turned this over. He said he had recognized the handwriting in the notebook. He said he had seen that handwriting before. He said there had been a folded piece of paper in the bottom of a wooden toy chest when he was 10 years old, and when he had asked his mother what it was, she had said it was his father's work. He said he had kept the paper in the chest, and that it had still been there when he went to college, and that he had not thought about it in 30 years until he saw page 47 this morning. Harold was quiet. He said I packed quickly. I did not realize. Gerald said it was a schematic for the valve. Harold said yes. Gerald said you put your only backup copy in a 10-year-old's toy chest. Harold said he had not had many places he trusted to be safe at that particular time. He said he had trusted Gerald with it. The word trusted arrived in the space between them with the weight of everything that had not been said over 30 years. Not an accusation. Not a gesture toward reconciliation. A fact offered in the same register Harold offered all facts, as something that had been true all along and was only now being confirmed aloud. Gerald looked at the tank. He looked at his father's hand resting on his knee, the same hand that had been on the hull all morning. He said, 30 years. Harold said 30 years. Gerald said, I do not know where to begin with that. Harold said, I do not either. He paused. But I do not think that is the part that matters. Gerald looked at him. Harold said the part that matters is sitting here. Not forgiveness, not resolution, not the closing of something old. The opening of something that had been closed so long they had both learned to move around the shape of it without noticing. Gerald sat with it. He did not try to make it more than it was. He had spent 15 years in rooms where people inflated things to fill the space available, and he had learned to distrust that instinct. This was enough. This was in fact more than he had come here expecting. He said he was going to file the assessment as incomplete pending additional documentation. He said he was going to recommend conservation status for the vehicle. He said he was going to put the recommendation in writing with his full name on it and deliver it directly to the board rather than through Harwell's office. Harold said that will cost you the contract. Gerald said probably. Harold did not say anything. Gerald did not need him to. What happened in the following 60 days did not arrive with the drama of the morning that had set it in motion. It arrived the way most meaningful things arrive incrementally, in the language of institutional correspondence and documentation and process, which is slow and procedural and entirely unsexy, and which produces in the end outcomes that endure longer than the morning that caused them. The 13 names from page 1 of the notebook entered the official record of the Marine Corps History Division. Strand made the call he had promised to make and used his name and his 15 years in the documentation. History Division provided, and the attribution review process was opened, and would take time but had begun, which was different from not having begun. Gerald filed his assessment and lost the Harwell contract and gained without seeking it a reputation in certain circles for the kind of work that could not be purchased in the direction of a preferred conclusion. 3 weeks before the 50-year anniversary celebration, a letter arrived at the museum from a woman in Macon, Georgia. Her name was Patricia Donaldson Webb. She was 67 years old and had found a news item about the M60A1 restoration and the Field Bible exhibit through a grandchild who tracked these things on the internet and had thought she should see it. Her father was Ray Donaldson. She had not known until she read the item that her father's name was in a notebook that had been carried in a canvas bag for 55 years. She had not known until she read it that her father had been one of the people who figured out how to keep those machines running in conditions no one had planned for. She asked if she might come to the opening. Foster called Harold to tell him. He said, tell her what all of them did, not just her father. Tell her all 13 names and what the work was so she arrives knowing she belongs to something larger than one name. Foster did this. On the evening before the exhibit opened after the last of the installation crew had finished, and the cases were sealed and the lighting was set. Amy Connors stayed in the room alone. She had asked Foster if she could have 20 minutes, and Foster had said, take what you need. She stood in front of the central case where the notebook lay open under glass. Page 47 the way Harold had specified. The schematic in pencil and ink. The handwriting of a 23-year-old who had known it needed to outlast the conditions that made it necessary. She had written a note in her own logbook 3 weeks before any of this happened. She had written that the intake housing was too clean. She had been right about that observation, and she had not known what it meant. Harold had not come to this museum because of her note. He had come because of a promise to a woman who had died, and a newspaper sentence and 4 years of standing in a parking lot on Wednesdays. Her note had not changed anything, but she had seen something real. She had looked at a machine that 3 months of formal training and $40,000 of equipment had not been sufficient to read. And she had seen something real, and she had written it down, and she had not withdrawn it when she was told it had no value. She took out her own notebook, the one she had been keeping since she arrived at the station. She opened it to a blank page near the middle. She did not try to imitate the schematic on page 47. She did not try to model the precision or the economy of that handwriting. She wrote the date and the name of the vehicle and the nature of the problem and the nature of the solution. And then she wrote in her own phrasing the principle underneath all of it. That equipment reads systems. That the people who built the systems in the field in conditions no one planned for are a different category of document entirely. And that document has an expiration date attached to the lives of the people who carry it. And the expiration date is always sooner than you think. She closed the notebook. She looked at page 47 under the glass one more time. She turned off the light when she left. Patricia Donaldson Webb came to the opening with a grown son who had taken the day off work and did not fully understand why they were there until he stood in front of the first panel and read the 13 names. And his mother put her hand on the glass case and did not speak for a long time. She was 67 years old, and her father had died when she was 19, and she had spent 48 years not knowing this specific thing about him. And now she knew it, and the knowing did not reduce the grief of not having known sooner. It added something to a different part of the same place. Harold stood in the far corner of the exhibit room and watched her. He had dressed for the opening without thinking about it. The field jacket and the plain clothes of a man who does not dress to be seen. He watched Patricia Donaldson Webb stand at the glass case, and he was not present in any documentary sense. He did not introduce himself or seek to be recognized. He was there the way a person is present at a thing they have waited for quietly at the edge, in full awareness that the center of the moment does not belong to them. He had asked himself in the Restoration Bay 3 weeks ago whether anyone would actually want to know about those 13 men. Whether the knowledge had a place in this world, or whether it would arrive and find nowhere to land. He had his answer. He did not need to articulate it. He simply looked at the woman in front of the case, with her hand on the glass, and let the answer be what it was. 2 weeks after the exhibit opened, Harold sat at the kitchen table in the apartment in Dumfries and looked at the number on his monthly statement. The Defense Finance and Accounting Service had been deducting incorrectly from his pension for 8 years. The error had originated in a transcription discrepancy between 2 different record systems, a discrepancy that had persisted because correcting it required documentation that the official systems could not locate. The documentation had now been located and verified. The correction had been applied. The back payment would follow. He looked at the number for a while. He looked toward the bedroom doorway. He picked up the phone. Gerald answered on the second ring. Harold said the pension was corrected. Gerald said he was glad to hear that. A pause. Harold said, "You made a call." Gerald said he had made several. He said the documentation from the museum had provided the verification that the official channels had been unable to locate on their own. He said it was a matter of connecting the right file to the right desk. He said it was the kind of work he had been doing for 15 years, and this particular application of it had not been difficult. Harold said, "I appreciate it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. This was different from the silences that had characterized 30 years of distance. That silence had been the silence of 2 people on opposite sides of a closed door. This silence was 2 people standing in the same hallway close enough to hear each other breathe. Figuring out how doors work, Gerald said he was going to be in the area the following month for a different engagement. He asked if Harold wanted to get coffee. Harold said yes. The conversation ended there. It was 23 words long from Harold's first sentence to his last. It was the most substantial phone call they had conducted in 15 years. He set the phone on the table and looked at the statement again. He did not celebrate the correction. He noted it with the satisfaction of a man for whom accuracy, finally achieved, is its own sufficient reward. 8 years of an error had not broken him. The correction of the error did not restore anything that the error had taken from his actual life. The coffee he had not bought, the distances he had not driven, the small economies of a man on a fixed income who had believed the fixed amount to be less than it was. What the correction gave him was not what it returned. It was something smaller and more durable. The confirmation that the record could be made accurate, that the mechanisms existed, that the right information in the right hands eventually found the right desk. He thought about the 13 names now formally in the Marine Corps history record. He thought about Patricia Donaldson Webb's hand on the glass. He thought about the notebook in its case under the lights on page 47. He looked toward the bedroom doorway. He said some of it, Margaret. Not all of it, but some. He stood and put the kettle on. June came with the specific heat of a Virginia summer that had decided to arrive early and without apology. The 50th anniversary of the museum fell on a Saturday with a sky that offered no clouds and no shade, and the kind of sun that makes the metal surfaces of vehicles uncomfortable to touch for anyone who has not spent enough time near them to develop the necessary indifference. Harold left the apartment at 8:30. He went down the stairs and past the chair where the canvas bag sat. He was at the car before he noticed. He stood beside the driver's door for a moment. He was aware of the absence the way you are aware of a sound that stops as a presence rather than a lack. The bag had been on his shoulder, or within arm's reach for 55 years. Its weight had changed over time. The notebook was in a museum case now. The photograph was in a document archive. The oilcloth package had been unwrapped and its contents installed. The bag held very little of what it had once held. But he had put it on every morning for 55 years, and he had not until this morning left without it. He stood at the car for 15 seconds. He got in. He drove to the museum without the bag. Gerald was already there when Harold arrived. He was standing near the outer exhibition area with a cup of coffee, wearing clothes that suggested he had thought about what to wear, and had resolved that question in a direction that was neither formal nor careless. He saw Harold cross the parking lot and raised his hand. Not a wave, just an acknowledgement. Harold raised his own hand in return. The same gesture. They walked to the observation area together and did not talk much on the way, which was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of progress. At 11 o'clock, the M60A1 was brought out. The engine was audible from the parking lot. Not symbolic, not ceremonial. The actual sound of the actual machine running at operational capacity in the summer heat. The Continental FIV-12 turning over at a register that required your chest to participate. People turned toward the sound before they saw the vehicle. The sound arrived first, which was the correct order. Harold climbed into the commander's cupola. He moved. The way he had always moved with these machines, the negotiation between memory and current capacity, the body knowing the sequence and accepting the cost. He settled into the position and put his right hand on the hull and looked forward down the demonstration course. Gerald watched from the observation area. He watched his father's hand go to the hull, and he understood for the first time in context what that gesture meant. He had seen it in the photograph on the kitchen counter for 30 years. He had seen it in the restoration bay on the morning when the engine started. He understood now that it was not habit and not sentiment, and not any kind of performance. It was contact. The particular contact between a person and the thing they were responsible for, the tactile confirmation that it was present and real, and could be counted on. The hand of a man who had never stopped being responsible regardless of whether anyone had continued asking him to be. The tank moved. It moved the way large things move when they have been correctly maintained and correctly understood with the authority of something that knows what it is for. The vibration carried across the ground and into the feet of the people watching that particular frequency of the machine at work. which was the same frequency Harold had felt through his palm in 1969 and 1970, in conditions that the engineers in Lima had not accounted for, and that had not in the end broken the machine or the men who kept it running. Harold looked forward and did not smile. He had nothing to perform. 55 years had changed the hearing and the back and the hair, and the person who should have been watching from the grass with her arms folded. And that particular expression she had reserved for moments. She found it impossible to pretend she had anticipated. The vibration had not changed. The responsibility had not changed. The meaning of the hand on the hull had not changed. Gerald watched and did not look away. He had one hand resting on the back of the empty seat beside him. He had not intended to do it. He did not move it. The demonstration lasted 12 minutes. The M60A1 returned to its position, and the engine settled, and then stilled, and the silence that followed was different from the silence it had held for 23 years. This silence was the silence of rest, not absence. The silence of a machine that had run today and would run again properly understood. Properly maintained its history, finally in the hands of people who knew to ask what was gone, as well as what remained. Harold climbed down. Owens was there to receive him, not with ceremony, but with presence, the way a good mechanic is present at the end of a machine's work, alert and close. Harold nodded once. Owens said nothing. The nod was enough. Harold and Gerald drove to a diner on Route 1 and ordered coffee, and did not speak for a while after the order came. The diner had the particular afternoon quiet of a place between rushes, the staff moving with the unhurried ease of people who know the pace will change again and are not in a hurry for it. Gerald said he had a new engagement starting in 3 weeks. He said it was in Baltimore. He said he was going to drive down rather than fly. Harold said that was a reasonable choice. Gerald said he thought he might stop in Dumfries on the way. Harold said, "I will put the kettle on." It was not an effusion. It was not the language of men who had found their way back to each other in a morning of large moments and decided that everything was therefore resolved. It was the language of men who had agreed to start, which is a different and more durable thing. It was an invitation made in the vocabulary of the ordinary, which is where most things that matter actually live. Gerald said, "Good." Harold got home at 4:15. He came up the stairs and into the apartment and put his keys on the hook and stood in the small entryway and looked at the canvas bag on the chair. He picked it up. It was lighter than it had been for 55 years. Not empty, but no longer freighted the same way. The notebook was under glass on page 47. The photograph was in an archive. The oilcloth package had served its purpose. What remained inside was a few sheets of paper. A pencil, a business card from Briggs that had come in the mail last week. A folded map of the museum grounds from the day they had given him a formal tour. And he had put the map in the bag without looking at it, because that was where things went. He put it over his shoulder. Some habits are not about their contents. Some habits are about the act of carrying itself, the commitment made so long ago that it has become a feature of the person, rather than a practice, something that belongs to you as much as the set of your shoulders or the way you hold a cup. The bag was lighter. He carried it anyway. He went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat at the table. He did not open a technical bulletin. He did not read anything. He sat in the specific silence of an apartment where the primary work has been done, and what remains is the ordinary work of continuing, which is not a lesser kind of work, which is in fact the work that requires the most endurance and receives the least recognition, which was something Harold understood entirely without needing it said. The kettle began its sound, that particular rising note that means the water has decided. He looked toward the bedroom doorway. The glasses were on the shelf in the light coming through the window, at an angle that changed in color, depending on the time of day and the season. And that, at this particular hour in June, was the warm, particular gold of late afternoon, the light that does not last. He said you were right about the plan. He sat with it for a moment. The engine sound from the museum's demonstration course had been audible from the parking lot. She would have been able to hear it if she had been there. She would have recognized it as the sound the story had been moving toward all along. The way she had always recognized things before they fully arrived, with that quality of attention that saw the shape of what was coming before it came. He stood to pour the water. The canvas bag hung on the back of the chair, lighter than it had been since 1969 carried anyway. The way some things are carried long after the weight that made them necessary has changed, because the carrying itself has become the point. Because some acts of fidelity are not to a thing, but to the commitment that the thing once represented, which does not expire when the thing is gone. Outside the window, the June light was doing what June light does in Northern Virginia at the end of the afternoon, which is to make everything look briefly like it costs nothing, like the world is offering it freely, like the ordinary evening is a gift rather than a continuation. Harold poured the water. He sat back down. The apartment was very quiet and entirely his, and full in every corner and in every considered object, and in the sound the chair made and the weight of the bag behind him, with the specific presence of a life that had been lived on its own terms, which is the only life that remains intact when you sit at the end of a long day and ask it to account for itself. He drank the coffee. He let the evening come.